She had traveled 11 days to marry a man she'd never met, and he took one look at her, then walked away with another woman without saying a single word. Henrietta Mosley stood on that platform with $2, a broken suitcase, and nothing left to lose. What happened next nobody in Llano Depot expected, least of all her. This is a story about a woman the world kept trying to throw away, and the quiet man who finally decided to pick her up. Stay until the end. Hit like if this moves you, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The train lurched to a stop, and Henrietta Mosley grabbed the overhead rail to keep from pitching forward into the woman seated across from her. A woman in a blue silk dress who hadn't spoken a single word the entire trip from Kansas City. 11 days. Henrietta had counted every one of them. She gathered her things slowly. The other passengers were already pushing toward the doors, pulling down hat boxes and leather traveling bags that cost more than Henrietta made in a season. Her own bag was a dull brown thing, the clasp broken and held shut with a length of twine she'd knotted herself outside of Abilene when the latch finally gave out. She'd been carrying that bag since she was 19. She was 31 now. Llano Depot came into view through the window. A flat, sun-hammered strip of buildings that looked like they'd been dropped from a height and had never quite recovered. A water tower. A general store. A livery at the far end of the street trailing off into nothing. Beyond it all, open country stretched so far in every direction that it made her chest tighten just looking at it. She stepped down onto the platform. The heat was immediate and total. Not the damp, suffocating heat she'd known in Missouri, but something drier and sharper, like breathing near an open oven. She set her bag down and straightened her coat, a heavy wool thing, wrong for the weather, but it was the only coat she owned, and looked around for Bartholomew Hoffman. He'd described himself in his letters. Tall, she'd been told, brown beard, a gray felt hat with a crease in the left side of the brim. He was a cattle broker who worked the territory between two ranch counties, and he'd placed an ad in the Missouri Farmers Register seeking a wife. He had not asked for beauty. He had not asked for money or connections. He had asked, specifically, for a woman who knew how to work and wasn't afraid of hard weather. Henrietta had answered that ad because for the first time in her 31 years, she felt like she qualified. She spotted him across the platform before he saw her. He was exactly as described. Tall, brown beard, though it needed trimming, the gray hat. He was watching the train with the impatient energy of a man who'd been waiting longer than he planned, arms crossed, shifting his weight from one boot to the other. She raised her hand. He saw her. His eyes moved across her face, then down to her coat, her bag, the twine holding it shut. His expression didn't change exactly. It didn't harden or curl into disgust. It just went still. The way a man's face goes still when he's made a calculation. Then the woman in the blue silk dress came down the steps behind Henrietta. Henrietta heard the change in the air before she saw it. The way the men on the platform seemed to collectively straighten, the way conversations quieted. She turned. The widow. She found out later that's what she was. A widow from St. Louis with a cattle yard inheritance and no children to slow her down, stepped off that train like she'd been expected, which in some ways she had been, though not by anyone in particular. She was handsome, not young, maybe 40, but handsome in the way of a woman who had always been looked at and had learned to carry it naturally. Bartholomew Hoffman was across the platform in 4 strides. He didn't look back at Henrietta. Not once. She stood there holding her hand up for a moment longer, then lowered it. She didn't cry. She wasn't built for crying in public, had learned early that it only made things worse, only gave people something to talk about. She picked up her bag instead and moved to a bench at the far end of the platform and sat down. The planks were hot through her skirt. A dog was sleeping in the shade under the water tank. The train's engine was venting steam in long, slow exhales. Bartholomew Hoffman had his hand out to the widow. She was smiling at something he said. He had not said a word to Henrietta. Not a word. $2.30. She counted it in her coat pocket without taking it out, just pressing her fingers against the coins, feeling the edges. $2.30 and a return fare she couldn't afford. She hadn't slept properly in 4 days. Her back hurt from the train seats. She'd eaten half a biscuit that morning at the last stop because the prices at the station counter were higher than she'd expected. She thought, quietly and without drama, that this might be the worst moment of her life so far. She was wrong, but she didn't know that yet. Theodore Beckerson had come to town that morning for one bag of feed and a new buckle for one of his harness straps, and he was ready to leave again inside of 20 minutes. He didn't like Llano Depot particularly. It was loud in a way that felt forced, like a town that hadn't quite decided what it wanted to be yet. And the people in it had that same unsettled quality that made him feel like everyone was watching for something. He'd been watching the train arrive from across the street, not because he cared about the train, but because his horses were spooked by the whistle and he needed them calm before he loaded the feed. He'd seen the whole thing without meaning to. He'd seen the woman in the wool coat raise her hand. He'd seen the man in the gray hat look at her and look away. He'd seen the widow come down the steps, and he'd seen Bartholomew Hoffman walk across that platform like a man who had never made a promise to anyone in his life. He'd seen the woman in the wool coat sit down and put her hand in her pocket. He loaded his feed. He buckled the harness. He had daughters waiting at home, a ranch that needed him, and enough of his own trouble without taking on anyone else's. He drove past the platform on his way out of town. She was still there. Her bag was on the bench beside her. She was looking out at the street with the particular stillness of a person who has already run through their options and found them wanting. He stopped the wagon. He told himself later that it wasn't kindness so much as practicality. Leaving a woman alone on a platform in a town that had no hotel, only a boarding house that didn't take women traveling alone, wasn't something he could do and then sleep that night. That was all. It wasn't sentiment. He climbed down and crossed the platform. She didn't look up until he was close enough that ignoring him would have taken effort. "You need somewhere to sit that isn't out here?" he said. She looked at him. Her eyes were brown, and there were circles under them from not sleeping, and her expression was the expression of someone who has had enough of being sized up for one day. "I'm fine," she said. "Whole town saw what happened," he said, not unkindly, but directly. "Mrs. Purvis at the general store already knows your name. That's how it is here." She said nothing. He took his hat off and held it in front of him, not because he particularly wanted to, but because it seemed like the kind of gesture the moment required. "My name is Theodore Beckerson," he said. "I've got a ranch about 12 miles west. I've got 2 daughters who are 5 years old and more trouble than I know what to do with. And I've been looking for a woman who's willing to come out and see if the situation suits her." She stared at him. "You're proposing to me. Right now." "No," he said. "I'm offering you somewhere to go that isn't this bench. Whether it turns into anything else is a conversation that doesn't need to happen today." Something shifted in her face. Not warmth exactly, but the beginning of something that could become warmth if it had the right conditions. "I have $2, she said. "I know. And a broken bag." "I can see that." She looked at him for a long moment. He didn't fill the silence. He waited, because he'd learned that rushing a woman's decision was the fastest way to get the wrong one. "My name is Henrietta Mosley," she said finally. "Miss Mosley. I'm not delicate, and I'm not pretty, and I don't know anything about ranching." "I didn't ask about any of that." She picked up her bag. The ride west was quiet in the way that rides between strangers are quiet. Not uncomfortable, but careful. He drove. She sat beside him with her bag between her feet and watched the country open up around them, the flat scrub giving way to something rougher and more broken as they moved away from town, the horizon pulling back to make room for sky she hadn't known existed outside of dreams. After about a mile, a small voice came from the wagon bed behind them. "Papa, she doesn't have any ribbons." Henrietta turned. 2 small girls were sitting in the wagon bed among the feed bags, identical down to the gap in their front teeth. They were staring at her with the frank, unfiltered assessment of children who haven't yet learned to pretend they aren't looking. Ted didn't look back. "Cora, enough." "I was just saying. I heard what you were saying." The other twin, smaller by a visible degree, quieter, was watching Henrietta with a different kind of attention, more careful, like she was trying to figure something out. "What are their names?" Henrietta asked, keeping her voice even. "Cora and Ruth." He paused. "Cora is the one who talks. Ruth is the one who listens and waits and then gets you when you're not expecting it." "That's not fair," said Ruth, which made him almost smile. Henrietta looked at them. They were dirty in the honest way of children who played outside in real dirt. Cora's hair was loose and tangled, and Ruth had a small cut healing above her eyebrow. They looked like children who were being raised well in terms of food and shelter, and not so well in terms of someone with time to sit with them. She didn't say that. It wasn't her place yet, and she was aware enough to know it. "How long has it been?" she asked Ted, quietly enough that the girls would miss it. "Since they had anyone." He looked straight ahead. "Their mother passed when they were 2. "I'm sorry." He nodded once. That was all. She understood that it was a topic shaped like a wound that hadn't fully closed, and she left it alone. The ranch appeared at the end of a long, rutted drive. A house, a barn, a chicken run, fencing that stretched out on both sides until it bent out of sight with the land. It was not pretty. The house needed paint, and one of the porch steps had been replaced with a plank that didn't quite match. The kitchen garden was real but uneven, like it had been planted in a hurry and maintained by someone with too many other things to do. She recognized all of it. She recognized the look of a place run by a person doing the work of 2 people alone. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. The girls were already down, Cora running ahead to the porch, Ruth hanging back near the wagon, still watching. "You can sleep in the room off the kitchen," Ted said. "It's small." "I don't need much room." He carried her bag inside. She stood in the kitchen for a moment and looked at it. The iron stove, the mismatched shelves, the clean but tired feeling of a space that had been functional for a long time without being comfortable. Then she rolled up her sleeves, went to the stove, and started looking for what there was to cook for supper. Ruth appeared in the kitchen doorway. Henrietta didn't look up. "You going to watch, or you going to help?" A pause. "Help," said Ruth. "Then wash your hands and find me an onion." That first night, after the girls were in bed and the kitchen was cleaned, Ted sat on the porch steps with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Henrietta came out and sat 2 steps down from him, not because she was being deferential, but because it was cooler down where she was. "You should know," she said, "that I'm not doing this out of desperation." He raised an eyebrow at that. "I mean, I am," she said. "I came out here because I had nothing else, and Bartholomew Hoffman made it clear he didn't want me. But I'm not going to pretend I'm something I'm not to stay somewhere warm. If this doesn't suit both of us, I'll figure something else out." "That's fair," he said. "What are you looking for exactly?" "Not in a wife. I mean right now. What does your day need?" He thought about it. "Someone who doesn't leave the stove burning. Someone who doesn't let Ruth sit in the corner by herself for too long. Someone who doesn't flinch when the work is harder than expected." "I can do all of that." "I know," he said. "That's why I stopped the wagon." She looked out at the dark country past the fence line. There was no sound out here like the sounds she knew, no city noise, no close neighbors, just wind and something far out that might have been coyotes. "What happened to their mother?" she asked. A long pause. "She left during a storm," he said. 3 years ago. We never found her." Henrietta sat with that. "You think she left on purpose?" "I don't know," he said. "I think about it every day. I think she was unhappy, and I don't think I saw it clearly enough, and I think that's on me." He paused. "I'm not telling you that to scare you off. I'm telling you because you're going to hear a version of it from someone in town eventually, and I'd rather you heard mine first." "I appreciate that," she said. They sat without talking for a while. The cold coffee, the dark country, the sound of the wind. "I'm not her," Henrietta said finally. "I want you to know that. I've spent my whole life in situations that were hard, and I've never run from one yet." He looked at her sideways in the dark. "I believe you," he said. She nodded and went inside. She lay in the small room off the kitchen, on a narrow bed with a quilt that smelled like cedar and old wool, and stared at the ceiling. Her back still ached from the train. Her pride still stung from the platform. But underneath both of those things, something else was sitting quiet. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. She wasn't sure what to call it yet. She closed her eyes and slept. She burned the biscuits on her 3rd morning. Not badly. They were salvageable if you scraped the bottoms and didn't look too closely. But she burned them, and Cora noticed immediately, because Cora noticed everything and had no particular instinct for keeping what she noticed to herself. "These taste like the barn smells," Cora said, holding one up and examining it. "Cora?" Ted didn't look up from his coffee. "I'm just saying." Henrietta took the biscuit out of Cora's hand, set it back on the plate, and sat down across from her. "I know, I let the stove run too hot. I'll do better tomorrow." Cora squinted at her. Mama's biscuits were good. The kitchen went quiet in the particular way of a room where someone has said something that can't be unsaid. Ted set his cup down. Ruth was watching from her chair with that careful, measuring look she'd had since the first day. Henrietta kept her expression level. I'm sure they were. Mine will get better. It wasn't the most graceful moment she'd ever navigated, but she didn't flinch from it, and that seemed to be enough, at least for now. Ted picked his cup back up. Ruth quietly ate her biscuit without commenting on the taste. Cora scraped the bottom of hers against the table edge and ate it anyway, which Henrietta took as a small, grudging vote of tolerance. The mornings had a shape to them that she was still learning. Ted was up before light, out to the barn while the sky was still gray, and didn't come back to the house until he needed something, water, or a tool from the shed beside the kitchen, or occasionally just to stand in the doorway for a moment like a man recalibrating himself before going back out. The girls woke when the sun came fully up, noisier and more sudden than she'd expected, like they'd been storing energy overnight specifically for the moment of waking. She'd learned on day one that Ruth wouldn't eat if her spoon wasn't on the left side of the bowl. She didn't know why, and Ruth wouldn't say why, but if the spoon was on the right, Ruth would sit with her hands in her lap and not touch the food until someone moved it. Henrietta moved it now, without being asked, without commenting on it, and Ruth would glance at her with those watchful eyes and begin eating. Small things. But she was a woman who understood that small things were usually the actual things. On the fourth day, Ted asked her to help him mend a section of fence on the north pasture. She'd never mended fence in her life. She'd grown up in a boarding house in St. Joseph, then worked for 6 years as a seamstress's assistant, then 2 years keeping books for a dry goods store whose owner paid late more often than not. She knew fabric and numbers, and how to stretch a dollar past the point it wanted to go. She did not know wire. She didn't say any of this. She followed him out with her coat on, and her sleeves already rolled and listened while he showed her how to hold the wire stretcher and how much tension was needed before you fastened the staple. Her hands were not soft. She'd never had the kind of life that produced soft hands, but they weren't trained for this, and the wire found the gaps in her grip and left thin red lines across her palms that stung when she gripped harder. She gripped harder. You don't have to do it like that, Ted said, watching her from the other post. You'll tear your hands up. They'll toughen. They'll bleed first. Then they'll toughen after that. He looked at her for a moment, said nothing, went back to his side of the fence. They worked through the morning. He didn't talk much, and she didn't need him to. There was a kind of companionship she recognized in the work itself, the rhythm of two people doing a job, the way the silence between them wasn't empty but occupied, full of the small sounds and adjustments of people learning each other's pace. She'd had it before with the women at the seamstress shop. She hadn't expected to find it here, with a man she'd known 4 days, mending wire in the middle of country so flat and large it made her feel briefly like she might disappear into it. When they stopped at midday, he handed her a strip of cloth from his coat pocket, clean, folded, nothing she'd have expected him to have. For your hands, he said. She looked down. The cuts weren't deep, but they'd been weeping since mid-morning. She'd ignored them so thoroughly she'd almost stopped noticing them. Thank you, she said, and wound the cloth around her right palm. He sat down on a flat rock and took out a wrapped sandwich. She sat on the ground a few feet away because there was nowhere else, and the ground was as good as anything. The sun was directly overhead, and it was warmer than she'd dressed for. Where are the girls? She asked. Mrs. Aldine from the neighboring property. She takes them Tuesdays. He paused. She used to take them more often, after their mother. She's been a help. Is she the kind of woman who asks a lot of questions? He almost smiled. She is the kind of woman who already knows the answers and is asking to see if you'll tell her the truth. I'll keep that in mind. She'll come by Thursday, he said. She'll want to look at you. Look at me like what? He seemed to consider how to say it. Like a woman who wants to know if the situation here is decent. She's been watching out for Cora and Ruth since they were 2. She takes that seriously. Henrietta nodded. She understood that. It was even something she appreciated, though she wasn't going to say so out loud just yet. And if she decides it isn't decent, she'll tell me directly, and then she'll tell the rest of the county, and it'll be a whole thing. Wonderful, Henrietta said. She'll like you, Ted said. Probably. She doesn't like people who try too hard. I don't know how to try too hard. I just know how to try. He looked at her again with that sideways attention he had, the kind that felt less like being assessed and more like being actually noticed. That's different, he agreed. Mrs. Adeline Pierce arrived Thursday in a wagon driven by her grandson, a boy of about 12 who had the look of someone resigned to being useful. She was a broad woman, not fat exactly, but solid, with gray hair pinned flat and a pair of eyes the color of creek water on a cloudy day. She brought a covered dish, some kind of potato thing that smelled like butter and onion, and she carried it up the porch steps without waiting to be invited. Henrietta met her at the door. They looked at each other. "You're the one from Missouri," Mrs. Pierce said. "Yes, ma'am." "He told me you came out to marry Bartholomew Hoffman." "That was the original plan. And then Bartholomew Hoffman saw Margaret Alderton step off the train." "That was the revision." Mrs. Pierce studied her for another moment. "Come help me put this down somewhere. My arms are tired." They went to the kitchen together. Henrietta moved the coffee pot and cleared a space on the table. Mrs. Pierce set her dish down and looked around the kitchen with the careful eye of a woman who had spent decades reading houses like text. "It's cleaner than it was," she said. "He tried, but he didn't really know how. He's been doing a lot of things alone." "He has." She pulled out a chair and sat in it heavily. "Where are the girls?" "Out back. Ruth's feeding the chickens. Cora's building something. I'm not sure what." "She does that. Built a whole fort in the barn last spring. Took Ted 4 hours to realize she'd used the good lumber." Something that wasn't quite a smile crossed her face. "She's going to be a hell of a person someday if someone can survive her childhood." Henrietta poured 2 cups of coffee without being asked and put one in front of Mrs. Pierce. The woman glanced at the cup and then back up at her. "You're not nervous," Mrs. Pierce said. It was halfway between an observation and a question. "I'm nervous," Henrietta said. "I just don't see the point in showing it." "Good answer." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "What do you think of the place?" "It's hard," Henrietta said honestly. "The work is hard. The country is harder. I burned the biscuits on the 3rd day and one of the girls told me they tasted like the barn." "That would be Cora." "Yes. And you didn't cry or pack your bag." "No." Mrs. Pierce drank her coffee. "Theodore Beckerson is a decent man," she said. "Quiet in a way some people mistake for coldness, but isn't. He was a different man when Clara was alive, more open, I suppose. Losing her the way he did closed something in him. He told me she disappeared in a storm." "He tell you he spent 2 weeks looking?" Henrietta hadn't known that. She wrapped her hands around her own cup. "He went out every day for 14 days, Mrs. Pierce said. Him and 3 other men from the county. Covered 30 miles in every direction. Never found her." She paused. "I don't know if you can understand what that does to a person, not knowing whether it was an accident or whether she chose it, living with both possibilities every morning." "I think I understand it better than you'd expect," Henrietta said quietly. The older woman looked at her. "Why's that?" "Because I know what it's like to be the person nobody looks for." The kitchen was still for a moment. Then Mrs. Pierce said, "You'll do," in a tone that sounded like it cost her something to admit. That night, Henrietta sat at the kitchen table after the girls were in bed and tried to write a letter to her cousin in St. Joseph. She'd promised, when she left, that she'd write within the first month. She'd been here 9 days. She got as far as Dear Marguerite and then sat with the pen in her hand for a long time. What was she supposed to say? That she'd come out to marry a man who'd looked at her and walked away? That she was living on a ranch with a widower and 2 wild-haired 5-year-olds who still weren't sure they wanted her here? That she'd spent the morning mending fence with cut-up hands and had felt, oddly and without explanation, more like herself than she had in years? She put the pen down. Ted came in from the barn late, the way he sometimes did, stopping at the sink to wash his hands. He glanced at the table. "Couldn't sleep?" he said. "Trying to write a letter?" He dried his hands and looked at the single line on the paper. "Tough going." "I don't know what to tell her," Henrietta said. "She'll want to know if I'm all right. I don't know what all right looks like out here yet." He sat down at the other end of the table. Not close, just nearby. "What would you tell her if you had to say something true?" She thought about it. That it's harder than I expected and not the way I expected it to be hard, and that the girls are something. They are, he agreed. Ruth put a dead beetle in my coat pocket this morning, Henrietta said, wrapped in a piece of cloth, like a present. He stared at her. I don't know if it was a present or a test, she said. With Ruth, it could be either. What did you do with it? I thanked her and put it on the windowsill. Something moved in his face. Something that looked like relief, or maybe like a door opening in a room that had been shut a long time. That was the right answer, he said. I gathered. He was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, Cora cried last night, after you were in bed. I heard her through the wall. Henrietta set her pen down entirely. What was she crying about? Wouldn't say. He rubbed a hand across his jaw. She does it sometimes. Not often. I think she misses something she doesn't have words for yet. Her mother. Or the idea of one. She was 2. She doesn't remember Clara clearly. What she misses is the shape of it. Someone who... He stopped. Started again. Someone who's there in the morning and there at night and knows where her things are. Henrietta listened. I'm not good at that part, he said. It wasn't self-pity, just a plain statement of fact delivered by a man who had made peace with his own limitations. I know how to keep them fed and safe. I don't know how to be softer than that. Nobody's born knowing how, she said. No, but some people learn it easier. I'm not soft either, Henrietta said. If you're expecting soft, you've got the wrong woman. I know that. But I know how to pay attention, she said. And I think for a child, those are almost the same thing. He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp between them was burning low and needed trimming, and the light it threw was uneven, better on her side of the table than his. Outside, the wind had picked up the way it did most nights out here, pushing against the house like something that wanted in. Why did you come all the way out here, he said, to marry a man you'd never met? It was the first direct personal question he'd asked her, and she appreciated that he'd waited 9 days to ask it. Because he said he wanted someone who could work, she said, and that was the whole list. No mention of what she looked like, or what family she came from, or whether she had money. And I thought, she paused, I thought that for once in my life I might actually be what someone was looking for. He didn't offer any kind of reassurance. She was glad. She didn't want reassurance. She wanted someone to hear it plainly, and he did. You had other offers before? She shook her head. Not real ones. A man in St. Joseph courted me for 6 months and then married a woman 10 years younger. A man at the dry goods store where I kept books used to make hints about the future. But what he actually wanted was someone to manage his accounts for free and look grateful about it. She folded her hands on the table. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you so you know I'm not carrying any illusions about how the world works. I don't think you are, he said. Good. She pushed her chair back. I'm going to try to sleep. Tell Cora tomorrow that the biscuits will be better. Will they? Yes, she said. I figured out the stove. She went to her room and lay down on the narrow bed and listened to the wind, and somewhere between one breath and the next, she realized she hadn't thought about Bartholomew Hoffman in 3 days. The following week brought a hard frost that nobody had warned her about. Not because they'd forgotten, but because out here a frost in this season was ordinary enough that it didn't seem worth mentioning, which was itself a thing she was learning about this country. The things that would have been catastrophic events back in Missouri were simply weather out here. Simply Tuesday. Ted was already in the barn with the animals by the time she got the stove going, and Henrietta found Cora standing in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, staring at the frost on the window glass with an expression of complete delight. It looks like the whole world went white, Cora said. It does, Henrietta agreed. Can we go out? After you eat and put boots on. Ruth's still sleeping. Then she'll miss the first look. Henrietta handed Cora a cup of warm milk. Come sit. Cora sat, which was notable because Cora rarely sat voluntarily. She wrapped both hands around the cup and stared at the window. The frost made the glass look like lace, intricate and temporary, and the morning light behind it was the particular pale gold of cold, clear days. Did you have frost where you lived before? Cora asked. Yes, but not like this. This is bigger. Everything's bigger here, Cora said, with the certainty of a child who has spent her entire life in one place and therefore knows it as the standard. It is, Henrietta said. She sat down across from her with her own coffee. Do you like it? The big? Cora thought about this seriously, the way she thought about most things when she actually stopped moving long enough to think. Sometimes. Sometimes it feels like there's too much of it and not enough of me. Henrietta looked at this 5-year-old girl and thought, yes, that's exactly what it feels like. I think that's normal, she said. I think you just keep going until you feel big enough for it. Cora considered her. Are you big enough for it yet? Not yet, Henrietta said honestly. But I'm getting there. Ruth appeared in the doorway, hair wild, squinting against the kitchen light, and saw Cora already at the table with warm milk. Her expression shifted through indignation to calculation to resignation in about 4 seconds. Henrietta had her cup ready. Ruth sat down and moved her spoon to the left side without comment. Henrietta didn't comment either. Outside, the frost held for another 2 hours before the sun took it. Ted came in at mid-morning for coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the pasture. The girls were out there bundled up, Cora running in wide circles for no apparent reason, Ruth standing at the fence with her arms folded on the top rail, looking at the horses the way she looked at most things, steadily and with patience that seemed too old for her small body. She wants to ride, Ted said, watching Ruth. Has she ever? Not alone. I've taken her up with me. He wrapped both hands around his cup. She's not afraid of them, never has been. Henrietta looked at Ruth through the window. The girl hadn't moved. One of the horses had come to the fence and was standing within arm's reach, and Ruth raised her hand slowly and touched its nose, and the horse didn't flinch. She's good with things that don't talk, Henrietta said. Ted was quiet for a moment. Clara was like that, he said. Then, as if he hadn't meant to say it, sorry. Don't apologize, Henrietta said. You're allowed to say her name. He looked at her. She was their mother, Henrietta said, and she was your wife. She happened. I'm not going to pretend she didn't. He nodded slowly, looking back out the window at his daughters in the cold. There was something in his expression she couldn't quite read. Not grief exactly, more like the particular weight of a man who has been carrying something alone for so long he's forgotten other arrangements are possible. She refilled his cup without asking and went back to the stove. She didn't say anything else, and neither did he. But something between them that had been careful and uncertain shifted slightly, the way a door settles differently in its frame when the weather changes. Not open, not closed, just easier than it was before. 3 weeks in, Henrietta made a mistake that cost her more than cut hands. It started small, the way most real mistakes do. She'd noticed that the feed storage in the barn was badly organized, sacks stacked against the wrong wall, moisture getting in from the east side where the boards had a gap nobody had caulked since probably the previous winter. She'd asked Ted about it twice, briefly, and he'd said he'd get to it, and she'd taken that to mean soon, which out here apparently meant sometime before it became a crisis. On a Wednesday morning when Ted was in town for supplies and the girls were with Mrs. Pierce, she rearranged it herself. She moved the sacks. She found old boards in the back of the barn and nailed them over the gap. Badly, she knew, but functionally. She reorganized the tools on the south wall by size and use. She threw out 3 things that were so rusted they weren't tools anymore, just metal, the shape of tools. She swept the whole floor and found, under a pile of old straw in the corner, a wooden box she didn't recognize. She opened it. Inside were letters, a woman's handwriting, on paper so thin it had gone soft with age. Not many, maybe a dozen. She didn't read them. She understood immediately what they were and closed the lid and set the box back exactly where she'd found it and covered it with fresh straw. But Ted came back to a reorganized barn, and he saw the swept floor and the caulked wall and the neatly arranged tools, and something in his face went wrong. Not angry, worse than angry. He went quiet in a different way than his usual quiet. Not the quiet of a man at ease, but the quiet of a man holding something down hard. I should have asked, Henrietta said. She was standing in the barn doorway. She'd known, seeing his face, that this conversation was going to be necessary. Yes, he said, you should have. The moisture was going to get into the feed. Another 2 weeks and we'd have lost half of it. I know that, he said. I know the barn. I know what needs doing in it. Then why hasn't it been done? She regretted it as soon as she said it. Not because it wasn't a fair question, but because the timing was wrong. She'd asked it on the back of defending herself, and it came out like an accusation instead of a question, which was not what she meant. He turned away from her and started unhitching the horses. Ted, leave it for tonight, he said. His voice wasn't cruel. It was the voice of a man who had reached his limit for the day and knew it. Please. She left it. Dinner that night was quiet in the wrong way. The girls picked up on it the way children always do. Not understanding the specifics, but feeling the temperature of the room and adjusting accordingly. Cora ate without comment, which was unusual enough to be alarming. Ruth kept her eyes on her plate. After they were in bed, Henrietta sat in the kitchen with the lamp low and waited. He came in eventually, poured himself water instead of coffee, which she'd learned meant he was too tired even for the ritual of coffee. He sat at the table and put both hands flat on the surface and looked at them. Clara used to rearrange things, he said. Henrietta waited. When she was unhappy, she'd reorganize. The kitchen, the pantry, the sitting room. I'd come in and things would be moved, and I never knew whether to say something or not. He paused. After a while, I learned it meant something was wrong that she wasn't saying. I'm not Clara, Henrietta said, as gently as she knew how to say it. No. He looked up. I know that, but I walked into the barn and it was different, and my first thought wasn't the practical one. What was it? He rubbed his face. That someone had been through something that was mine, something I hadn't been ready to share yet. She thought about the box in the corner, the thin paper, the soft handwriting. I found the letters, she said. In the corner. I didn't read them. I put them back. Something crossed his face. Surprise, and then something more complicated. I don't want to go through things that belong to you, she said. That wasn't what I was doing. I saw a problem, and I fixed it. And I did it without asking because I've spent my whole life fixing things that needed fixing without anyone to ask. That's a habit I have. It's not always right, but it's not what you thought it was either. He was quiet for a long moment. The lamp threw its uneven light. Outside, the wind was doing what it always did. I know, he said finally. I know that's not what it was. I'll ask next time, she said. I'll get to things faster, he said. It wasn't an apology exactly from either of them, but it was the honest shape of one, and she understood that for a man like Ted and a woman like her, the honest shape was going to have to be enough. October came in sideways, with wind that had teeth in it and a sky that changed moods 3 times before noon. The ranch work shifted. Less fence, more preparation. The endless winterizing that Henrietta was only beginning to understand had its own logic and sequence, a particular order of tasks that you ignored at your own cost. She learned to split wood. Not well at first. She'd hit the log wrong half the time, and the axe would skid sideways and she'd have to wrench it back out and start again. But she was stubborn about it the same way she was stubborn about everything, and by the end of the 2nd week she had a usable rhythm, if not a graceful one. Her shoulders ached constantly. She slept harder than she had in years. Cora decided around this time that she wanted to teach Henrietta to play a game she'd invented. The rules were unclear and seemed to change whenever Cora was losing, but the basic structure involved stones laid out in a pattern on the kitchen floor and some system of counting that Cora tracked privately in her head and refused to explain. You cheated, Cora told her one evening, placing a stone with the authority of a much older person. I don't know the rules well enough to cheat. That's what people say when they cheat. Henrietta looked at this child. Where did you learn that? Cora shrugged. Mrs. Pierce says it to her grandson. Ted was at the table with a harness in pieces in front of him, pretending not to be listening. Henrietta could tell he was listening by the fact that he hadn't moved in 4 minutes. All right, Henrietta said. What's the penalty for cheating? Cora considered this with the gravity of a legislator. You have to do the dishes. I already do the dishes. You have to do them twice. That's not a penalty. That's just more work. You could braid my hair instead, Cora offered. And that was how Henrietta ended up on the kitchen floor at 7:30 with Cora between her knees, working through hair that was genuinely tangled in ways that suggested it hadn't been properly attended to in some time. Cora winced when the comb hit a knot. and Henrietta held the root so it didn't pull, the way she'd learned from an older woman in the boarding house when she was a girl. "My papa doesn't know how to do this," Cora said. "I know. He tries, but it hurts more when he tries." "He's learning," Henrietta said, working through a knot with her fingers first. "Are you going to stay?" Cora asked. Just like that. No preamble. In the direct way she said everything. Henrietta paused for only a second. "I'm planning on it." "People say that," Cora said, "and then they leave." Henrietta thought about what to say. She could have offered reassurance, the easy, automatic kind that adults give children to stop them from asking uncomfortable questions. But Cora was 5 going on 40, and she'd know the difference. "I know people do that," Henrietta said, "and I can't promise you the future because I don't own it. But I can tell you that I don't have anywhere else I want to be, and I don't give up on things easy. That's the most honest thing I can tell you." Cora thought about this. "Ruth likes you," she said, as if this settled something. "Does Ruth tell you things like that?" "No, but I can tell she gave you the beetle." "She did," Henrietta agreed. "She didn't give me the beetle," Cora said, and her voice had in it the precise note of a child who has been mildly wronged and intends to remember it. "Maybe she's saving you something better," Henrietta said. She finished the braid and tied it with a strip of cloth from her pocket. Not fancy. She had no ribbon to spare, son, but neat, and it would hold through the night at least. Cora reached back and touched the braid. Then she got up and went to the hallway without a word, because that was how Cora received things, quickly and in private. Ted's hands had stopped moving on the harness. He didn't say anything, and neither did she. And in the way of people who are slowly learning each other's language, neither of them needed to. The letter from Marguerite arrived on a Thursday in late October, carried out from town by a neighbor who passed the ranch road on his way back from the post office. Henrietta read it twice at the kitchen table while the girls were outside and Ted was in the barn. Her cousin's handwriting was round and urgent, the kind of handwriting that matched her voice. A woman who lived loudly and with great investment in the people around her. "Hetty," the letter started because Marguerite had called her Hetty since they were children, which Henrietta normally would have corrected but had long since given up on. "I heard about Bartholomew Hoffman from Mrs. Daly, who heard it from her sister-in-law in Abilene. I want you to know I am furious on your behalf and have said so to anyone who would listen. Are you all right? Where are you? Your last letter said almost nothing, and I have been constructing disasters in my head for 3 weeks." She read the rest. Marguerite's life in St. Joseph was the same as it had always been. Busy, slightly chaotic, held together by the force of her own personality. She'd had a quarrel with their neighbor about a fence line. She'd gotten a cat. She'd started attending a lecture series on Friday evenings and thought Henrietta would have found the third one interesting. At the end, "Tell me honestly if you are somewhere decent. Tell me honestly if you need me to come." Henrietta sat for a while with the letter on the table. Then she turned it over and wrote on the back, because she had no other paper handy, Marguerite. "I am somewhere decent. Better than decent, I think, though it's too soon to say for certain. The man is quiet and honest and has 2 daughters who are 5 years old and determined to rearrange my understanding of most things. I burned the biscuits in the first week, but I have not repeated it. The country is large. I'm getting used to large. Don't come? Not yet. But I'll write more soon." She signed it Hetty, because Marguerite would have it no other way. She folded it and set it where she'd remember to send it next time someone went to town. The real trouble began the second week of November, and it didn't begin on the ranch. It came from town, as most trouble did, carried on the tongue of a woman named Vera Schultz, who ran the post office and considered the management of community information to be a civic service rather than gossip, which was a distinction she alone believed. Ted had gone in for supplies. He came back with a set jaw and didn't mention anything at dinner, but Henrietta caught him at the porch afterward. "What happened in town?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "People are talking." "About what, specifically?" "About you living here." He said it plainly, not with embarrassment, but with the specific discomfort of a man who considers other people's opinions about his private life to be a particular kind of invasion. "About the arrangement, whether it's appropriate." "We're not married," Henrietta said. "Is that the objection?" "That's part of it." He paused. Vera Schultz suggested to 3 people at the post office that a woman who'd been turned down by one man and moved into another man's house inside of a week had a certain kind of character. The insult landed cleanly. She let it land because she'd learned that flinching didn't help. "And what do you think?" she said. "I think Vera Schultz has never done a hard day's work in her life and has built her personality out of other people's business," he said, without particular heat but with the flatness of a man who had considered it and arrived at a verdict. "That's not what I asked," Henrietta said. "I asked what you think of me, of the arrangement." He turned to look at her directly. "I think you've been here 6 weeks and my daughters are cleaner and better fed and my barn doesn't have a moisture problem anymore. I think you asked for nothing you weren't willing to work for. I think what Vera Schultz says about your character is not something I have any patience for." She held his gaze. "People will keep talking." "Yes. Unless there's a reason they can't anymore." He was quiet. The implication sat between them. Not dramatic, not decorated, just there. "That's not a decision I want to rush," he said carefully. "I'm not rushing it," she said. "I'm pointing out the situation." "I know the situation," he said. "I've been in it since I stopped the wagon." She nodded and went inside because the conversation had reached the edge of what both of them were ready to say, and she had learned by now that Ted processed things slowly and quietly, and that pushing him past his pace got nothing useful. She lay in her room that night and stared at the ceiling and thought about what Vera Schultz had said and felt the particular cold of it. Not because she was surprised, because she was never surprised when someone found a way to make a woman's survival look like a character flaw. She was used to that. She'd been managing people's readings of her since she was young enough to understand that a plain woman with no money and no family name was always going to be interpreted before she was understood. What she felt wasn't wounded pride. It was something more like exhaustion, the kind that comes not from one blow, but from a lifetime of smaller ones stacking up. She told Ted she didn't give up on things easy. She meant it. But that night, in the dark, she let herself acknowledge that not giving up required something from her that she didn't always have in surplus. She was still working out where to refill it. The answer, when it came from an unexpected direction. Ruth knocked on her door at some point past midnight. Henrietta heard it first as part of a dream and then as a real sound, and she sat up and said, "Come in." And the door opened and Ruth stood there in her nightgown with her hair loose and an expression Henrietta couldn't quite read in the dark. "I heard you," Ruth said. "What do you mean?" "In the kitchen, earlier. I heard what Mrs. Schultz said." Ruth came in and stood by the bed. She was small in the dark, smaller than she seemed in the daytime. "She said something mean about you at the market last week, too. Mrs. Pierce told her to mind her business." "She did?" "Yes." Ruth paused. "I don't think you should go." Henrietta was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going anywhere." "Papa thinks you might." "Did he say that?" "No, but I can tell." Ruth pushed her hair out of her face. "He thinks people leave. It's what he thinks. Even when they say they won't." Henrietta pulled the quilt back. "Come here," she said. Ruth climbed in and sat next to her, small and warm, her legs not quite reaching the edge of the mattress. "I told your sister the truth," Henrietta said. "I don't have anywhere else I want to be. That's still true." Ruth was quiet. Then, "Cora says you braided her hair." "I did. She said it didn't hurt." "It takes a little longer that way," Henrietta said. "But it's not hard." Ruth considered this. "Could you do mine sometime?" "Anytime you want." Another pause, the long kind. Then Ruth said very quietly, "I'm glad you didn't marry the man from the train." Henrietta looked at this child in the dark. This small, still, careful person who had spent 3 years watching and waiting and measuring everything before she trusted it. "Me too," Henrietta said, and she meant it. She really, genuinely meant it. Ruth stayed another 10 minutes, not talking, just sitting. Then she climbed down and went back to her own room, and Henrietta lay back in the dark and felt, underneath the exhaustion and the sting of what the town was saying, something that was steadier than either of those things. The kind of steady that comes from knowing, without needing proof, that you are exactly where you are supposed to be. The first real snow came on a Sunday. Henrietta knew it was coming before it arrived. The air had that particular held breath quality she'd noticed twice before out here, a kind of pressure that built in the hours before weather changed, like the land itself was bracing. She'd gotten the firewood stacked on the porch the day before without being asked, and when Ted came in from the barn that morning and saw it, he looked at it, and then at her with an expression she was starting to recognize as his version of being impressed. He didn't say anything. He poured his coffee. She'd learned to accept that as a compliment. By mid-morning, the snow was coming down in the serious way. Not decorative, not the light first snow that children ran out to catch on their tongues, but the kind that meant business, the kind that changed what the day was going to be and required you to adjust accordingly. Ted stayed close to the house and barn, moving between them with the efficiency of a man who had done this enough times to have a system. Henrietta kept the stove going and worked through the mending pile that had accumulated over the past 2 weeks. Shirts, 2 pairs of work trousers, a sock with a hole that had been worn around the heel so many times it had become a second hole. Cora and Ruth were at the kitchen table with a piece of brown paper Ted had brought from town, drawing. Cora was drawing something large and complicated that required the entire paper. Ruth was drawing in the corner Cora had left her, working small and careful the way she did everything. "What is that?" Henrietta asked, passing behind Cora with an armload of mending. "A horse," Cora said, "with wings. Horses don't have wings. This one does. Her name is Margaret." "That's a very formal name for a flying horse." "She's formal," Cora said, as if this should have been obvious. Henrietta sat down with the mending and started on the shirt. Ruth looked up from her corner of the paper and held it so Henrietta could see. A small house, a fence, 4 figures in front of it. 2 tall, 2 short. "Is that us?" Henrietta said. Ruth looked at it. "Yes." "You made me taller than I am." "I made you the same as Papa," Ruth said, "because you're both the same amount of important." Henrietta kept her eyes on the shirt in her hands for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Thank you, Ruth," she said, when she was sure her voice would come out level. Outside, the snow kept falling, and the ranch disappeared into white, and the 4 of them stayed inside where it was warm, and the morning passed in the slow, unhurried way of a day that has been unexpectedly given back to you. Ted found the box himself. That was how it happened. He'd gone into the barn for something on a Sunday afternoon in late November, when the snow from the first storm had compacted into something harder and meaner, and Henrietta heard him come back into the house with a different quality of footstep than usual. Not heavy, not angry, just deliberate, like each step was being placed with care. She was in the kitchen. He came and stood in the doorway, and he had the wooden box in his hands. She'd wondered when this moment would come. She'd thought about it more than once since the day she'd found it and put it back. Thought about whether she should say something, whether she should leave it alone entirely, whether there was a right way to handle something that was so clearly not hers to touch. She put down what she was doing. "I forgot it was there," he said. His voice was careful. "I put it there when after she was gone. I meant to deal with it, and I just didn't." "You don't have to tell me anything about it," Henrietta said. "I know." He came and sat at the table, set the box on the surface between them like he wasn't sure what else to do with it. "They're letters she wrote, but never sent. To her mother in Ohio. Clara's mother didn't approve of the move out here. They'd argued about it badly, right before we left, and Clara kept writing to her even after they stopped speaking. Just writing and not sending." Henrietta looked at the box. "I read them after she was gone," he said. "I needed to understand." He pressed his hand flat on the lid. "She was unhappy here. She wrote about it in those letters. Not in a way she'd ever said to my face. She was private about that kind of thing. Wouldn't say when something was wrong until it had been wrong a long time. But in those letters she wrote it all out." A pause. "She wrote that she felt like she was disappearing, that the land was too big, and the work was too much, and she didn't know who she was anymore, outside of being a wife and a mother in the middle of nowhere." Henrietta didn't offer anything. She waited. "I keep thinking," he said, "that I should have seen it, that there were things she was saying that I didn't hear right. And then I think, I don't know. Maybe I did hear them, and I didn't know what to do with them. Maybe I thought it was a season and it would pass." He looked at the box. "It didn't pass." "You couldn't have known she'd leave," Henrietta said. "No, but I could have known she was going before she went. There's a difference." She sat with that. Outside, the wind had picked up again, pressing against the kitchen wall like it was testing the seams. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. Not challenging, just asking. He looked up at her. "Because you're still here," he said. "And I don't want to make the same mistake twice. I don't want to be the kind of man who doesn't say things until it's too late to say them." "What is it you want to say?" He was quiet for a moment. Ted was not a man who spoke before he'd worked something through, and she'd learned to respect that, to wait for it instead of filling the silence herself. "I think you're unhappy sometimes," he said. "And I don't know if it's the work or the country or the girls or me. And I'd rather you told me than wrote it in a box." It surprised her enough that she almost laughed, not from humor but from the relief of being seen clearly enough to be worried about. "I'm not unhappy," she said. "Not the way you mean. Some days are hard. Some days I feel like I don't know what I'm doing well enough to be doing it. Some days the country is still too big, and I don't know yet how to be big enough back." She folded her hands on the table. "But that's different from what you're describing. I'm not disappearing. I'm still here at the end of every day, and I plan to be." He nodded slowly. "But I need you to hear me when I tell you something's wrong," she said. "Not fix it necessarily. Just hear it." "I'm working on that," he said. "I know you are." He picked up the box and held it for a moment, and she had the sense of a man who had been carrying something down a long road and was trying to figure out if he could put it down now or if he still needed it. "What will you do with them?" she asked. "I thought I might write back," he said. "To her mother. Just let her know what happened to Clara. She deserves to know, even if they weren't speaking." He paused. "I should have done it 3 years ago." "You should have," Henrietta agreed gently. "But you can do it now." He stood up and took the box back to the other room, and she turned back to the stove, and neither of them made more of it than that, which was itself a kind of progress. December arrived, and with it a run of clear, cold days that were brutal in the morning and briefly, almost painfully beautiful, in the afternoons when the low winter light hit the snow at an angle that made the whole pasture look like it had been hammered out of something precious. Henrietta was teaching the girls to read. This had started by accident. She'd been reading aloud one evening from the single novel in the house, a battered copy of a cattle drive story that was more adventure than literature but held their attention completely, and Cora had demanded to know what that word meant, and then that one, and then that one, and Ruth had begun following along with her finger on the page. Within 2 weeks, it had become an evening ritual. After supper, before bed, the three of them on the settee with the lamp pulled close. Ted sat near the fire with whatever needed mending or sharpening, not part of the reading exactly, but not apart from it either. One evening, Cora read an entire short paragraph herself, slow and halting, sounding out each syllable like she was pulling it from the page by force. When she reached the end, she looked up with an expression of pure, uncomplicated triumph. "I read it," she said. "You did," Henrietta said. "The whole thing." "Every word." Cora looked at her father. "Papa, I read the whole thing." "I heard," he said. He was looking at her with that expression Henrietta had come to recognize as the one he reserved for moments with his daughters, that meant more to him than he had language for. "Ruth hasn't read a whole one yet," Cora added. "That's because I read more carefully," Ruth said, without looking up from the page. "That doesn't even make sense." "It makes complete sense." Henrietta turned a laugh into a cough, and Ted looked at the ceiling. It was a good evening. Not dramatic, not significant in any way that would be obvious to an outside observer. Just good. The ordinary warmth of a house where 4 people were beginning, slowly and imperfectly, to know each other well enough to disagree and tease and sit in comfortable silence. She recognized it for what it was. She was careful not to grip it too hard. The trouble from town came back around in a different form in the second week of December, and this time it came in the shape of Bartholomew Hoffman himself. He came out to the ranch on a Tuesday morning. She didn't know he was coming. Ted didn't know he was coming, and knocked on the door with the air of a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say, and was fairly confident in it. Henrietta opened the door. They looked at each other. He had aged since the platform, or maybe she was just seeing him more clearly now, without the terror of her situation clouding the view. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, with the brown beard that needed trimming now as much as it had then. He had a quality of practiced ease that she recognized as a man who was very good at seeming like a good idea. "Miss Mosley," he said. "Mr. Hoffman," she said. Ted isn't here. He's in the south pasture. I came to speak with you, actually. She held the door where it was, not open wider, not closed. I can't imagine what about. He had the grace, at least, to look slightly uncomfortable. I wanted to explain about what happened at the station. You don't need to explain it, she said. I understood it clearly at the time. Mrs. Alderton, Margaret, she and I are not. The situation didn't develop the way I expected. He shifted his weight. I wanted you to know that. Henrietta looked at him. This man who had crossed a platform and walked away from her without a single word, who had not looked back once, who had left her standing with her hand in the air and $2 in her pocket and nowhere to go. I appreciate you telling me that, she said, and she kept her voice level because she was not going to give him the satisfaction of watching her react. But it doesn't change anything. You're living here, he said. He glanced around the porch, the yard. It looks... I'd heard things. I'm sure you have. People are saying ito. I know what people are saying, Henrietta said. People have been saying things about me my whole life. I'm still standing. He looked at her, and she had the very clear and specific sensation of being reassessed, of him looking at the woman on this porch and recalculating, the way men sometimes did when a woman they'd dismissed did something that didn't fit their original math. She didn't want to be recalculated. She was done being his math problem. I hope things work out well for you, she said, with perfect politeness and perfect finality. Have a safe ride back to town. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand still on the latch, and she was shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the concentrated effort of the last 5 minutes, the precise and demanding work of holding yourself together in front of a person who once had the power to humiliate you. Cora appeared from the hallway. Who was that? She said. Someone from a while ago, Henrietta said. No one important. Cora studied her face with that unnerving accuracy. You look like you do when the stove burns wrong. I'm fine, Henrietta said. Go get your coat. We're going to bring lunch to your father. She told Ted that evening. Not immediately. She waited until after supper, after the girls were in bed, because she'd decided somewhere between the door and the south pasture that she was going to tell him, and she wanted to do it without an audience. She told him plainly. Hoffman had come. What he'd said. What she'd said. What she'd noticed about his face when she closed the door. Ted listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd come to rely on. The way he actually listened. Not just waiting for his turn, but taking in what she was saying and sitting with it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He came to this house, he said. It wasn't a question. There was a quality to it she hadn't heard from him before, not anger, something more compressed than anger. He did, she said, to tell you that Margaret Alderton didn't work out. That was the general message, yes. He looked at the table. What do you want me to do about it? She shook her head. Nothing. I handled it. I'm telling you because you should know, not because I need you to fix it. He looked up at her. You're sure? Ted, I closed a door in Bartholomew Hoffman's face this morning. I'm quite sure. Something shifted in his expression. The compressed quality released slightly, and underneath it was something else. Something that had been sitting below the surface of these past weeks and was getting harder for both of them to pretend wasn't there. He had his chance, Ted said, on that platform. He had his chance and he walked away. He did. And now he's riding out here. He shook his head. That's the kind of man who only knows what he wants after someone else has it. The phrase landed and stayed in the air between them. Someone else has it. He heard himself say it and didn't walk it back, just looked at her steadily and let it mean what it meant. Henrietta held his gaze. Are we going to have this conversation? She said quietly. I think we probably need to, he said. She nodded. The lamp between them was burning evenly for once, and the house was quiet with the deep nighttime quiet of a place far from other places. And outside the snow was still on the ground, and she could hear nothing except the occasional shift of the house settling in the cold. I care about the girls, she said. I need you to know that first. Whatever else this is or isn't, I'm not staying because of how I feel about you. I'm staying because I'm needed here, and because this is the first place I've been in 31 years where being exactly who I am has been sufficient. I know that, he said, but I'd be lying if I said that's the whole of it, she said. I know that too, he said. She looked at him. This quiet, careful man with the shadows under his eyes, and the calloused hands, and the enormous weight of everything he'd lost, and everything he was still trying to hold together. This man who had stopped a wagon for a woman sitting on a bench and asked nothing in return, who had led her into his barn and his kitchen and his evening, and who flinched when she moved his things, not because he was controlling, but because he was afraid she was leaving, which were two entirely different things. I'm not going anywhere, she said, for what felt like the 100th time and the first time simultaneously. I'm starting to believe that, he said. Only starting? Getting close to certain, he said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before, something almost light, like a man reaching back for something he thought he'd lost the ability to do. She didn't push it further. She was learning, finally, that some things grew better in the space between people than they did when you handled them too directly. She stood up. I'm going to bed, she said. We've got the east fence tomorrow. I know. My hands are better, she said. I won't hold you up. You never held me up, he said. She took the lamp and went to her room and lay in the dark. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, the future didn't feel like something she was bracing against. It felt like something that was coming toward her, a little rough around the edges and nowhere near certain, but hers in a way she hadn't let herself believe in for a very long time. She closed her eyes and let herself want it. That was the most frightening and the most necessary thing she'd done since she'd stepped off that train. The east fence took 2 full days. On the second afternoon, with the light going thin and gold at the edges, and the temperature dropping fast enough that Henrietta could feel it in the joints of her fingers, Ted straightened up from the last post and looked out across the pasture and said, quietly, and without any particular ceremony, I wrote the letter. She looked at him. To Clara's mother? Posted it this morning before you were up. He drove the last staple with 2 clean hits. Told her what happened. Told her about the girls. Told her she had 2 granddaughters who were 5 years old and capable of causing significant structural damage if left unsupervised. He paused. I didn't know what else to say, so I said the true things. Henrietta pulled her coat tighter at the collar. That's all you can say. I don't know if she'll write back. She might not, Henrietta said. But you did it. He nodded once, and she understood that this was not a small thing for him. That sending that letter had required him to pick up something heavy he'd set down a long time ago and carry it a distance he'd been avoiding. She didn't make it larger than it was by saying so. She just gathered her tools and walked back to the wagon beside him, and that was enough. That night after supper, while Cora was attempting to teach Ruth the rules of her invented stone game, which had apparently gained several new amendments since Henrietta had last played, Ted brought a piece of paper to the table and sat down across from Henrietta and pushed it toward her. She picked it up. It was a rough sketch. The ranch house, the barn, the chicken run, the garden, but larger. A second room sketched onto the back of the house. A proper porch on 3 sides instead of 1. The kitchen garden twice its current size, with something that looked like a small orchard started at the far end. She looked at him. I've been thinking about what the place could be, he said. What it could be if there were 2 people working toward the same thing instead of one person holding everything together and hoping it doesn't fall. She set the paper down carefully. Ted, I know what I'm asking, he said. I know this isn't a speech. I don't have a speech. He rubbed the back of his neck. What I have is that sketch, and the knowledge that this ranch is better since you got here, and that my daughters are better, and that I am trying to be better. And I think you know all of that already. I do, she said. So I'm not asking you to be a ranch wife or a mother or any particular thing. I'm asking if you want to stay because you want to, not because you have nowhere else to go. Because that was true when you came, but I don't think it's true anymore, and I need to know the difference. She looked at him for a long moment. At this man who had taken 11 days and a refused wagon ride and a hard winter to get to a kitchen table with a piece of paper and something honest to say. Who had shown her his grief and his failures and the wooden box in the barn corner and let her see all of it without cleaning it up first. I want to stay, she said. Not because I have to, because I want to. He let out a breath, long and slow, the kind that a person holds without realizing it. All right, he said. All right, she said. From across the kitchen, without looking up from her stones, Cora said, Are you getting married? Cora, Ted said. I'm just asking. That's a conversation for another time. Mrs. Pierce said you'd be married by spring, Cora said. She bet Mrs. Finley a jar of apple preserves. Ted looked at the ceiling. Henrietta pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment and looked out the window. Go to bed, Cora, Ted said. I want to know if she wins. Cora. Cora picked up her stones with the dignified air of a woman who has made her point and chooses now to withdraw. Ruth followed, pausing in the doorway long enough to look at Henrietta with an expression that managed to contain, in the economy of a 5-year-old's face, something that looked very much like relief. Then she was gone, and it was just the two of them at the table with the sketch between them and the lamp burning lower than it should have been. And neither of them said anything else that night, but neither of them needed to. January was the hardest month. There was a stretch of 10 days where the temperature dropped so far that the water in the kitchen pump froze solid overnight despite the fire, and they had to melt snow in the pot every morning before they could do anything else. The animals needed more checking, more often. The girls were cooped inside and managing it with varying degrees of patience. Ruth retreating into herself with a book, Cora ricocheting off the walls with the compressed energy of a child who needed to run and had nowhere to go. On the 5th day of the cold snap, Cora knocked a jar of preserved plums off the pantry shelf, and it shattered on the floor, and the sugar syrup went everywhere, and Cora stood in the middle of it with an expression of genuine horror, watching the purple stain spread across the floorboards. Henrietta was in the doorway before she'd thought about it. She looked at the jar. She looked at Cora. She said, "Get the rag from under the sink," and that was all. No shout, no hard words, just the rag, and the two of them on their knees, mopping up cold syrup in the pantry while the smell of plums filled the small space. Cora was waiting for the correction. Henrietta could feel it. The child's entire body was braced for it, shoulders up, eyes down, the specific tension of someone who expects to be told what they did wrong in terms they'll hear for a while. "It was an accident," Henrietta said, working the rag into the seam between the floorboards. "Accidents happen." A long pause. "Mama used to get upset about the pantry," Cora said. Her voice was smaller than usual. "She said it was the one thing she kept nice." Henrietta kept working. "Your mama had a lot to manage," she said carefully. "I think when everything feels like too much, sometimes small things feel bigger than they are." "Are you upset?" "We lost the plums," Henrietta said. "That's a shame, but you're not the plums, and I'm not upset at you." Cora was quiet for a moment. Then, with the abruptness of a child who has reached the edge of an emotion she doesn't know what to do with. "I don't remember her very good." Henrietta sat back on her heels and looked at this girl. This loud, stubborn, magnificent child who pushed at everything to see what it was made of, who had been testing Henrietta since the first day with the burned biscuits because she needed to know whether Henrietta was the kind of person who stayed when things went wrong. "That's okay," Henrietta said. "You were very small." "Ruth says she remembers her singing," Cora said. "I don't remember that." "Some memories are feelings more than pictures," Henrietta said. "Sometimes you don't remember the person, you just remember that you felt safe, or that something was warm." She paused. "Do you have anything like that?" Cora thought about it seriously. "Maybe," she said. "Something that smells like outside, after rain." "That's a real memory," Henrietta said. "That counts." Cora looked at her with those direct, assessing eyes. "Do you think she would have liked you?" It was the kind of question that only a child could ask, the kind that went straight past all the layers of social protection that adults build up around the things that are actually true. Henrietta thought about it honestly. "I don't know," she said. "I think we were probably very different kinds of people, but I hope she would have known that I'm trying to do right by you, both of you." Cora picked up a piece of jar glass with a careful finger and put it on the rag. "I think she would," she said, with the decisive certainty that Cora brought to most of her conclusions, "because you don't act like you're pretending." "I'm not," Henrietta said. "I know," Cora said. "That's why." They finished cleaning the floor. Henrietta wrapped the broken glass in the rag and put it in the bin, and Cora went back to the kitchen, and the day went on the way days did out here, not stopping, not marking the moment as the thing it was, just continuing forward. But it was a thing. Henrietta knew it was. Ted proposed on a Thursday. Not with a speech, not with ceremony. He came in from the barn at midday and found her at the kitchen table going over the supply list for the next town run, and he sat down across from her and put a small piece of turquoise on the table between them. She looked at it. It was not a ring. It was a piece of turquoise stone, smooth and flat, with a hole worn through it naturally. The kind you found sometimes in stream beds made by years of water and nothing else. I found it in the creek last August, he said. I don't know why I kept it. I just put it in my pocket and didn't throw it away. He looked at it. I'd like to have a proper ring made. We'd have to go to town and have Daniels look at it. But I wanted you to have this first. So you'd know I've been thinking about this longer than last night. Henrietta picked up the stone. It was cool and smooth in her palm and lighter than it looked. August, she said. You found this in August. Before you came. She looked up at him. I'm not saying I knew, he said. I just kept it because it seemed like the kind of thing that shouldn't be thrown away. And then when you got here, He stopped. I never threw it away. She closed her hand around it. Yes, she said. Yes? Yes, she said again. That's my answer. He let out the same long breath she'd heard at this table a month ago, the one that said he'd been holding it longer than he realized. I'll talk to Daniels about the ring, he said. The stone is enough, she said. You deserve a ring. I'll have the ring, she said. I just want you to know the stone is enough. He reached across the table and closed his hand over hers, briefly, and that was all. No more than a few seconds. And then he stood up and went back outside because there was always more to do, and she sat at the table with the turquoise stone warm in her palm and the supply list forgotten beside it. She thought about August, a man alone in a stream bed, bending to pick up a stone for no reason he could name, putting it in his pocket, keeping it through fall and a hard winter, and the arrival of a woman off a train he hadn't planned for. She thought about 11 days on a train toward a man who would walk away from her. She thought about a bench on a platform and a wagon stopping and a quiet voice saying, "You need somewhere to sit that isn't out here?" People talked about fate like it was something arranged, like there was a design behind it and all you had to do was follow the plan. But she'd never believed in a plan, had spent too many years being ground down by circumstances that felt less like design and more like accident. What she believed in was the moment of choice inside the accident, the small turn, the open hand, the decision to stop the wagon. Ted had stopped the wagon. She had gotten in. Every good thing after that had come from those two facts. They married in the second week of March, when the snow was finally pulling back from the south-facing slopes and the creek behind the north pasture was running high and loud with the melt. Mrs. Pierce won her jar of preserves, though she had the decency not to mention it on the actual day. The ceremony was held at the ranch, not in town. That had been Henrietta's preference, and Ted had not argued with it. There was nothing in Llano Depot that she needed for this. No church or hall, no audience of people who'd spent the winter debating her character. What she needed was the kitchen table made decent with a cloth, and Mrs. Pierce and her grandson and the Aldine family from the neighboring property, and the justice of the peace who drove out from town and accepted a meal in payment because Ted asked him straight, and he was a fair man, and Cora and Ruth in clean dresses. Henrietta had made them herself, out of blue cotton she'd ordered through the general store, working in the evenings by lamplight for 3 weeks because she wanted them to have something new for it, not handed down and not borrowed. Ruth stood beside Henrietta during the brief ceremony with her hand tucked into Henrietta's hand without being asked, which was the most Ruth-like thing Ruth had ever done. Quiet, decided, no explanation, just the fact of it. Cora cried, which surprised everyone including Cora, who stopped mid-cry to look affronted by her own face and then started again because she couldn't help it. "I'm not sad," she clarified loudly, while Ted handed her his handkerchief. "I know," he said. "I don't know why I'm doing this." "It's fine, Cora. My eyes won't stop." "They'll stop," he said. "Give it a minute. Give it a eat." Mrs. Pierce was smiling in the corner in the specific way of a woman who has waited a long time for something to resolve and is satisfied to have been right about it. She'd brought a cake, a real one, with dried fruit and something that smelled like honey and took some doing in this country in March. And she set it on the kitchen table after, and there was coffee, and the afternoon light came through the window at the angle it had in winter, long and slanted, and made everything look more significant than it was, and also exactly as significant as it was, both at the same time. Bartholomew Hoffman was in town that day. He heard about it by evening, the way things traveled in small country places, quickly and completely and with every detail intact. He did not ride out. There was nothing to ride out for. Spring came and then summer, and the ranch changed shape in ways that Henrietta had sketched in her mind all winter. The second room was not finished. They ran out of lumber before they ran out of summer and had to order more, which meant waiting, which meant the east wall stood framed but open to the air for 6 weeks with a canvas tarp tacked across it that made a sound in the wind that Cora insisted was a drum. But it was started, and starting was its own kind of done. The kitchen garden doubled. Henrietta put in beans and squash and 2 rows of carrots that came up thin but came up, and one morning in June she found Ruth crouching at the end of the row, looking at the small green shoots with the patient attention she gave to things that were new and needed time. "They came," Ruth said. "They did," Henrietta said, crouching beside her. "I thought they might not." "They usually do, if you give them enough water and don't dig them up to check." Ruth looked at her sideways. "I didn't dig them up." "I know. I was speaking generally." Ruth looked back at the carrots. "Cora dug up the beans on the west end." "I know that too." She wanted to see if they were working. "I talked to her about it." "She cried again," Ruth said, with a certain sisterly satisfaction that she would have denied if accused of it. "She's been doing that more," Henrietta said. "She says it's because she's happy and it comes out wrong," Ruth said. "I think that's probably true. Cora's feelings are very large for her body." Henrietta looked at this child beside her, 6 years old now, with a vocabulary that continued to arrive in her conversation like unexpected weather, pulling you up short and making you pay attention. She'd started reading alone in her room at night. Ted had found her one morning with the lamp burned all the way down, the book on her chest, asleep across the cover with the look of someone who'd been defeated by exhaustion and not by choice. "Ruth," Henrietta said. Are you happy?" Ruth considered it in the careful way she considered things. Not a quick answer, not a polite one. An actual one. "Yes," she said. "I think mostly yes. There are still days that are sad, but they're not the most days." "That's about right," Henrietta said. "For most people." "Were you happy before you came here?" The honest answer was no. The careful answer was sometimes in small moments. The true answer was that she had been surviving, and she had been good at surviving, and she had mistaken being good at something for being satisfied by it. "I'm happier now," she said. Ruth nodded as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. They stayed crouched there for another minute, the two of them looking at the carrots. The morning was warm and the sky was that particular high summer blue that made the country look like it went on in every direction forever, which it more or less did. Then Ruth stood up and went back inside for breakfast, and Henrietta stayed a moment longer in the garden, her hands in the soil that she was still learning, on land that was still teaching her its own logic, in a life that had arrived through a broken door she hadn't intended to walk through. She thought about Marguerite's letter, the one she'd finally answered properly back in February. She'd told her cousin the truth, all of it, including Bartholomew Hoffman's visit, and the turquoise stone and the blue cotton dresses, and the way the country was still too big some mornings, but she was getting bigger to match it. Marguerite had written back, "Hetty, I have never read anything that made me cry and then laugh in the same paragraph. You sound like yourself. You sound like who you were always supposed to be before life kept getting in the way. I want to visit in the fall if the roads allow it. Say yes." She'd written back, "Yes." She wiped her hands on her apron and went inside to start breakfast, which was a meal she'd gotten good at. Finally. Not perfect. She didn't believe in perfect, but consistent and real, and made by hands that knew what they were doing now. There was an evening in late July that Henrietta would remember for the rest of her life, not because anything dramatic happened in it, but because of the specific quality of ordinary that it had. The kind of ordinary you can only recognize as rare when you've lived long enough without it. The four of them were on the porch after supper, in the last of the light. Ted had the piece of the rocker he'd been repairing on his knee and was working the joint with a rag, slow and methodical. Cora was lying on her back on the porch boards with her legs up the wall in a position that looked uncomfortable and apparently wasn't. Ruth was on the step below Henrietta, leaning back against Henrietta's legs, reading from the Cattle Drive novel that had started the reading lessons back in winter. She was most of the way through it now, reading silently, only occasionally asking about a word. The light went long and orange across the pasture. Somewhere down near the creek, a bird was making a sound that wasn't quite a song, but was close enough. "Henrietta," Cora said from her position on the boards. If we had a flying horse, where would we go?" "I don't know. Where would you go?" "Somewhere I've never been," Cora said. "Somewhere with water everywhere, like a whole big water you could see the other side of." "That's called an ocean," Ruth said without looking up. "I know what it's called." "Then why did you say water everywhere like you didn't know the word?" "Because I was describing how it feels, not what it's called." Ted looked at Henrietta over the girls' heads. She looked back at him. He had lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a year ago, or maybe they had been, and she was only now close enough to see them. He still didn't talk much, still held things down longer than was useful before he said them, still had mornings where the weight of the past 3 years sat on him in ways that nothing could shift before noon. He was not a healed man. He was a man who was healing, which was different, and she had learned not to confuse the two. She was not a healed woman either. She still flinched sometimes when she felt like she'd done something wrong and waited for the hammer of it. She still had days where the voice that told her she wasn't enough was louder than the evidence. She was working on it, the way you worked on fence posts and carrot rows, steadily, without the expectation that it would ever be entirely finished. But she was here. She was on this porch, on this warm July evening, with these people who were hers, and who she was. And that was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. Ted set down the piece of rocker and reached into his shirt pocket and brought out something small, which he held out to her across the girls. It was the turquoise stone. She'd set it on the bedroom windowsill, and it had stayed there, and she'd looked at it most mornings when the light hit it, and she hadn't thought much about the fact that he even noticed it. "Just wanted you to have it in your pocket today," he said. "No reason?" She took it. It was warm from being against him all day. "No reason," she repeated. "Seemed like the kind of day for a stone in your pocket," he said, and went back to the rocker. Cora lifted her head from the boards. "What stone?" "Nothing," they said at the same time. Cora looked between them and then back at the ceiling of the porch. "Adults are very strange," she announced. "Deeply strange," Ruth agreed, turning a page. The light faded. The bird went quiet. The evening came down in the slow, unhurried way of summer evenings in country that has room for them. Eventually, Ted got the joint on the rocker finished, and Cora fell asleep on the porch boards and had to be carried in, which she was young enough to sleep through and old enough to be embarrassed about later. Ruth finished her chapter, folded the corner of the page with precision, and went to bed without being told. Henrietta stayed on the porch a while longer after Ted had gone in. She sat with the turquoise stone in her hand and looked out at the dark pasture and the sky above it, which was doing what this sky always did when it got dark, filling up with more stars than she'd ever seen before she came out here, more than she'd known existed, packed in so dense and thick in places that they looked less like separate lights and more like something continuous, something that had been there the whole time, she just hadn't been somewhere quiet enough to see it. She thought about the train. 11 days. A platform in a flat town. A man who looked at her and looked away. $2 and a broken bag. She'd thought that was the worst moment of her life. She'd been wrong about that in the most specific, complete, and permanent way a person can be wrong about something. She thought about what she would tell her 31-year-old self if she could go back to that bench. Don't beg. She'd already known not to do that. But maybe. Don't be so sure the closed door is the whole story. Maybe the wagon is going to stop. Get in. Maybe nothing. Maybe the only thing that would have helped was exactly what happened, which was to sit on that bench with nothing left and have a quiet man in a gray afternoon stop and offer her somewhere to go. She couldn't have found this life if she'd been looking for it. She would have aimed wrong. She would have aimed for something she already understood, which would have been smaller than this and less likely to require her to become more than she already was. The thing was, the rejection had felt like ending. It had felt like proof. Another door shutting in the face of a woman who was never quite enough. Not pretty enough, not soft enough, not the right kind. She'd sat on that bench and felt the whole weight of 31 years of that and nearly believed it was true. But the bench was not the end of the story. The bench was the hinge. And what she knew now, what this land and this man and these two impossible girls had taught her over the course of one hard, ordinary, irreplaceable year, was that worth was not something other people could confirm or deny. Bartholomew Hoffman's assessment of her had been wrong, not because he was cruel, but because he was looking for something she wasn't, which is a different thing entirely. His blindness to her was not information about her. It was information about him, and it was not information she'd needed. What she'd needed was a man who would stop a wagon. What Cora had needed was someone who wouldn't flinch at the burned biscuits or the broken jar or the hard questions about mothers who were gone. What Ruth had needed was someone who would move the spoon to the left side of the bowl without making a thing of it. What the ranch had needed was two people working toward the same thing. None of that was what she'd come looking for, because she hadn't known it existed. You couldn't know a life like this was possible if you'd never been close enough to one to see it, and so she'd aimed lower. She'd aimed for acceptable, for adequate, for a man who'd have her because she was useful and not ask for more. She'd thought that was the reasonable ceiling for a plain woman of 31 with no money and no name. She'd been wrong about that too. She closed her hand around the stone, smooth and flat and worn through by water that had been patient and constant and hadn't tried to force it. The stars were enormous above the dark pasture. She sat with them a while longer, this woman who had arrived at a lonely train station with everything she owned in a bag held shut with twine. This woman who had been left standing on a platform and had not broken from it. This woman who could split wood now and mend fence and braid a child's hair without pulling and make biscuits that tasted nothing like the barn. She sat with the stars above her and the stone in her hand and the warm, quiet dark of a house where people were sleeping who were hers. Then she went inside and locked the door against the night and went to bed in a room that was hers, in a life that was hers, built not from what she'd wanted and found, but from what she'd survived and stayed for. That finally was enough. That finally was everything.